This morning we have the Reverend James Gale with us, who is the Executive Presbyter of the Presbytery of the Mid-South. Back in non-pandemic times, we worked together in the Presbytery office, where I also have an office for the UKirk side of my job. So James, I will let you take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you very much as people pop in. So Elizabeth asked me, I don't know if it was pre-pandemic or not, to kind of be with you all this morning and talk a little bit about what the heck is an executive presbyter and what I do. And then we talked a little bit about how to do that so that your eyes didn't glaze over and that you would wish you'd gone for a walk or something entertaining this morning. But I'm glad to be with you this morning, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to be with you, albeit remotely. I'm excited to meet you and see some of the faces of the Idlewild folks. If you didn't know, there was a little brief bio. I'm James Gale. I'm your executive presbyter. Before that, for the last 7 years, I worked for the Synod of Mid-America, which is Kansas and Missouri. And my job there was to work with presbytery executives and help them do presbytery work, especially finding presbytery executives for presbytery. So I did that for 7 years with my colleague that you might have heard of, Landon Whitsitt, who was the co-moderator of the General Assembly many, many moons ago. And then prior to that, I was in parish ministry for just under 10 years in Kansas and North Carolina. So that's kind of a little bit about where I come from. I served, my first church I served was about, on a good Sunday, we might have 25, and it was about 4 families, a little country church. My second church was about 125, and when I left, it was about 200 member church. And then I grew up in a big 4,000 member steeple church in Raleigh, North Carolina. So I kind of been all over the map. So I like to say, when I'm talking about church, I try and talk about it kind of from those 3 different perspectives. So this morning, what I thought I would do was I would not assume that you even knew what presbytery and presbyter and all these words are. If you don't know, the Presbyterians, when we gather for our General Assembly, they give new commissioners a dictionary of all the different words and acronyms we use. And there are currently 3,400 entries in that little booklet of different acronyms and words. So this morning, I thought I'd start by trying to show you just a little brief and walk through slideshow about generic polity of kind of how our church is set up. So that when I talk about what I do, you're not going, what is he speaking Chinese? What is that? And what is that? If there's ever a word or a term that I use, because this is what I do, and I just speak the words. If there's things that are acronyms or words that you don't know, somehow flag me or Elizabeth and be like, wait a minute, we don't know what that is. I try not to do that, but again, when you do this work, they just kind of flow off the tongue. And so if ever there's a term or a word, please do not hesitate to ask me about it. Because in my brain, I'm just like, everybody knows what AMRAC and ACSWAP and COMM and all those things are, and they don't. And we're working on it, but we're Presbyterians, right? So if this will work, let's see, Elizabeth, if I hit share, will it work?
Yes, Jenny told me that it would.
All right, let's see, that's my desktop. And let's see if I go over here and see if this works. We've got the bouncing icon. Okay, come on, open up. You know it's gonna break right when I need it to work, right? There we go. Okay, so I'm not gonna can everybody see that screen on your screen? Okay, full disclosure, I borrowed this from former stated clerk and native Eastern Tennessee Presbyterian Grady Parsons. So this is his slideshow he uses for his elder training, but I thought it was good and succinct, and therefore I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So again, we're going to just kind of go through. I'm not going to go super fast, but I don't want to spend 45 minutes because y'all are an intelligent group of people, but I just want to give you kind of a 30,000 foot view of Presbyterian polity. So when I talk about the word polity, that's one of those words that we'll use we're talking about the way a church governs itself. That's a fancy term for polity, is what we, church governance. And Presbyterian, let's see, hold on one sec. I got to get y'all out of the way. There we go. Okay, so there are two things in Presbyterian polity that you need to remember. We're representative, which means that we elect people to serve for us. So we're not one-to-one. And two, you'll hear this a lot, we're connectional. And what that means is that we believe that we exist in relationships within our own governance rather than we kind of do our own thing. So those are two really important things. And when I talk about what I do, you'll hear me talk about being connectional and relational. So that's important. Right now, this is a picture of our new co-moderators. So on the left is Alona Street Stewart, and on the right is Gregory Bentley. We're excited because Alona is the first Indigenous person, so what we would call Native American, elected to office in the PCUSA. So that's a big first for our church. And they were just elected a couple of weeks ago at our very exciting virtual General Assembly and started their work. So some of you on the call might be elders or deacons, and so you are also selected to be leaders in the denomination, if you didn't know that. And then just to kind of remind you, when we talk about council, you hear council, board, that's a fancy term for sort of leadership team in the church. You'll hear us call presbyteries and synods and General Assembly, we call ourselves mid-council. And so that's a term that we'll use. So you guys know the session, that's the governance board at your church that kind of oversees things. Then a group of sessions in an area make up a presbytery. And then 3 or more presbyteries make up a group called a synod. And then the 16 synods make up the whole thing called the General Assembly. So that's kind of how we break it up. Or I like to think of it as we have city government, county government, state government, and the national government. We kind of have that same sort of striation. So your church would be the session, and then your sessions, all of us together, would be presbytery. And then a session is your ruling elders that you elect, classes, 3 years, and teaching elders moderate your session. So that should be kind of hopefully old hat to y'all that you've seen before. Deacons, Calvin in his polity had deacons. He called them the hands and feet of Christ. They are those that do the ministry of compassion, witness, and service, or as I like to think, deacons are the one who actually make sure that we have a church that's open and welcoming when we come on Sunday mornings. Not that you elders don't do that, but and deacons also help us pastors do the pastoral care of the church. And so I think, do you guys have a board of deacons, right? You're bicameral. Okay, some churches, the session does it all, but usually in most churches you have 2 groups. And so here is a lovely little map of Presbytery as the governing body and geographic region. I don't know if you can find it, but they're right there in Tennessee. You can kind of find us. We're in the little corner right there, and the boundary that you see there is in color is our synod. So we're in Presbytery of the Mid-South. Our geographic footprint is basically a little bit of Missouri, the corner of Tennessee, and technically a little bit of Arkansas over towards West Memphis, even though we don't currently have a church right there. So you can kind of see on the map, that's our little thing there. And then in the Presbyterian church, we don't have a bishop. Technically, when other people ask me what I do, I ask them where tradition they're from. And usually if they're Lutheran, Catholic, or things, I explain I'm this equivalent to your bishop, and that I have all his or her responsibilities and none of their authority. So I kind of joke that I'm the bishop of nothing, which basically means my job is to help facilitate it, whereas in some other polity, that power is designated to 1 or 2 individuals. So we, as a presbytery, a collection of people, function in that role to do that work rather than one person. That's what's real important about our polity, and we'll talk a little bit about how that affects my work. But teaching elders, ministers of word and sacrament, we change each week about what we're called, but that's pastors. And then ruling elders, and then at Presbytery, we try and keep that number equal. And then together, we make up the Presbytery to do that work. And here in a couple of weeks, you guys will get to hear about and see the work of Presbytery working together and how we do stuff in August. And again, here are just another map to show you real quick. That big yellow block in the middle of the country, that's where I came from before I came to be with y'all. And then here is just basically the book of order, talks about what is a presbytery supposed to do. and I'm not going to read it all to you, but basically, our job is making sure about borders and making sure that congregations do their work, and making sure that we do all the pastors coming in and going and maintain the 6 great ends of the church. So in short, when someone says, what is a presbytery for? I like to say that presbytery is here to help congregations support their witness and work, or in short, we help you do what you do. And at least that's what I hope the vision of the presbytery would be. And you can see things, again, if you want to read your book of order, we're responsible for making sure that we have good preaching, the sacraments, that people are behaved. We're also responsible for relationships with the national office. And then, unfortunately, we're also the people who are responsible that when people misbehave, we have to hold them accountable. That part of our work these days is becoming more and more prevalent, whereas it used to not be something that was as much as we used to do. But unfortunately, some of this discipline stuff, churches departing, those kinds of things are just a little bit more what we're doing. And here's Synod, 3 or more presbyteries. We are in the Synod of Living Waters, which basically is little Alabama, Tennessee, a little bit of Arkansas, little piece of Missouri, kind of over in there. And you may have met the Reverend Greg Goodweiler. If you've ever seen him at a presbytery meeting, Greg is our Synod executive. And then the 16 collective synods, so there's 15 in the country, and then Puerto Rico, make up General Assembly. And the General Assembly meets every 2 years when it meets. So I put it in there because we don't know what's going to happen. But this year it was supposed to have been in Baltimore, but it was held virtually. And that's where we do sort of our national business. And the way that we do our business here, how we make decisions, I wish we raised our hand that nicely, but we don't. This again, servants of God, we kind of forget that sometimes. We try to be a community that listens for the direction of the Holy Spirit. So one of the unique things about Presbyterians are we make decisions as a body. We don't believe in you and me get in a room. We believe talk it out and the Spirit works among that. It's messy, but I think it's a really good way that we get, when done well, a lot of voices at the table. And so we believe in not necessarily pure consensus, but we try to work towards some kind of consensus when we're making decisions. Our Constitution, our governance, and the rules that all of us who are ordained work in are 2 parts. Of course, there's the Bible, but the Constitution itself is the Book of Confessions and the Book of Order. And if ever you are sleepy, I suggest you pull out a Book of Order and read. You'll be asleep in 15 minutes. The Book of Confessions, if you've never heard that, is sort of the creeds of the church. It starts with the Apostles' Creed and goes all the way up through the Belhar Confession, and it kind of talks about what we as a church believes over the decades. So those 2 documents are sort of our ground rules that we have. And as you can see, we're not going to dive in all those, but those are all the confessions for you to see. If you've never picked up a Book of Confessions, it's really kind of a fun thing to thumb through, because if you read something written in 1590 and something in 1983, you can see how the church has kind of evolved on her stances and sort of how some of the same things are still prevalent. So the Book of Order, there you go. That's our rule book. It has 4 sections now: the fundamentals, the governance, the worship, and the discipline. And that's sort of our written constitution there. When we meet, you've heard this a lot, and there's a lot of discussions that we're talking about now about Robert's Rules of Order, which is, if you've never experienced that, we have a very, what's the right word? Intricate way of talking and doing meetings. And we are having discussions about maybe we need to update that. But this is that, rule of parliamentary procedure stuff. If you ever watch C-SPAN and watch Congress and watch how they have all this language about how things are introduced, that's Robert's Rules of Order. And the reason we do this is we have to have some agreed upon system in doing it. And so being that Robert was Scottish and we're from a Scottish branch, we adopted that. But I will say that one of the things that we're having discussions about, especially after this General Assembly, is the way that we do meetings might need to have some conversation about how we do that. So any stated complaints about me picking on Robert's Rules of Order needs to go to Audrey Toombs at the Presbytery office. She's in charge of disciplining me. So since we're recording that, that's on record, and I'm okay with that. But the thing I think that we do need to remember, all jokes aside, is that we're trying to create a process that allows for prayer, for movement and discussion. And so in all of our governance work, as Presbyterians. We strive to be a place where we have multiple voices and opinions and protect not just the right of the majority, but what I like is we try to make sure the minority voices get heard as well. We don't always get there, but at least we're trying to make an effort to do it. And I think that's why, at least for me, I like Presbyterian polity, is that it tries to make a place for that. And then I think Grady put this in, and I think it's something we forget, is that all of our governance should be done with prayer and listening. And sometimes I think that's something that we forget, is governance is also a prayerful work. And then again, Presbytery is just a larger expression of the universal church, and we're relational for that. So our particular presbytery, so let me say a few words about who we are. If you didn't know, we used to be the Presbytery of Memphis, and then after reunification and some other things, we changed around and renamed it Mid-South. But we have roughly 40 churches, depending on how you want to count them. And the smallest church in the Presbytery is 5, and then y'all are the largest church in the Presbytery now. We have about 85, I think that's now 83, and since in the last 2 weeks, pastors on different roles, retired and so forth for that. And then we have our 2 campus ministries. So that's my shout out for Elizabeth and her work for that. So that's kind of who we are. And our presbytery has been around for a while and has been not a new presbytery. So we were here before that. In our presbytery, we have 3 staff positions, myself as the executive, and then we have Audrey, who's our stated clerk and office manager, administrator, and then Elizabeth is our other staff person. So we just have a staff of 3 in the presbytery to kind of do our work. And now, so that's sort of a crash course in 30,000 foot view about what polity is and sort of the generics. So I want to stop for a second. Is there any questions or anything that caught anybody in that, or is it pretty good to go? If I don't have any, I'll keep going, but I'm happy to stop and answer any. Anybody have anything? Okay, like I said, we'll have Q&A, but I want to make sure. Yeah, do we have one?
I got a question. You might mention to the group, and obviously we've got at Idlewild a pretty close connection with the council, the advisory council that sort of governs. It's not just the 3 of you in the presbytery office, driving things, but there is a council that.
Yes. Well, hey, good morning, Michael. So we'll kind of come back to this, but he brought up a good point that the actual date, the decision-making process in terms of how the policy and things, so that we're staff, but the governance part of it, we call it the administrative board. Some presbyteries call it council. Some people call it the steering committee. It has different names, but essentially it's the committee chairs plus a few other folks who get together on the 3rd Thursday of the month. And we have a moderator and a vice moderator who lead that meeting, as well as the moderator of the administrative board, who's the previous moderator. And so that group is sort of our business council that makes decisions. The staff do not vote in the decision-making process. We advise, but the decisions and policies of the presbytery are done by the council and by you, the body of the presbytery. So when Ann and company ask you to go to presbytery, you're there to help in the governance, not just to watch all of us talk, but you're there to actually help make decisions, so that in our polity, the decision-making and the authority is not with the staff, it's with the people, if it's done right and it's done well. And thank you, Mike. When I talk about kind of my role, you'll kind of hear more about how traditionally we tend to want it to be, I tell y'all what to do as the paid professional and you do it. Whereas as you'll hear from me, I'm much more of, I'm here to help you be awesome and facilitate you. The vision and the work and things belong to you. I'm just here to help you get from A to B and be awesome, not tell you how to do it. And I think that when I talk a little bit about what I do or how I do it, we'll get into that. But yes, that's important to know that the decision-making is done by that council, not by the staff folks. Ann, are you raising your hand?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Hey, James. So Joseph Hoyle has been the moderator of the presbytery. Michael and Carol Siemens have been involved at the financial level of the presbytery, just helping people know how some Idlewild.
And you were a moderator and vice moderator of the council.
I have done that, yes. We also have in the chat. There were some questions about because Lacey Cummings is a member of our congregation. So we've heard some, Peggy McClure asked about, is Lacey an employee of the Presbytery? So
No.
if you could address that with us.
Yes, in the old days, in the model before I got here, she was on the Presbytery staff, and we're working on defining this more closely as part of one of the things I'm here for. But Pinecrest is our ministry partner, but she is an employee of Pinecrest and overseen and partners with the Pinecrest board. So which does have interaction with our council, but for the clarity of today, without getting in real minutia, she would be an employee in person that works with Pinecrest board that we would partner with. But in terms of management, she is under Pinecrest, not under the Presbytery. So that's a really good question. Now, in the past, that was different. That change was made right before I got here. We kind of realigned some different things. So while she is a partner and participates in the admin board, she, like me, can give advice and things, is not a voting member of that board, but she does have a voice and she does attend our meetings to help us make decisions that are in partnership with Pinecrest. But technically, for governance purposes, we are A and B, and we're working on cleaning some of that up because that's a little bit new. But that's a great question. Thank you for asking. I don't have the chat were there any other that anybody saw? Because again, I want to make sure that I don't leave anybody behind. Oh, okay.
In the other ones.
Yeah, because I can't keep up with all. Y'all got to help. If there's any, just let me know. Like I said, just wave me down. So now that's kind of the generic thing. With you, what I want to talk about more about is kind of what I do. And as we have a little description, what I do, and hopefully make a case that it's something useful. And then talk a little bit about how all this was good and well until the pandemic hit and how that's kind of changed everything around. For those of you that weren't here when we first started, I was joking with Elizabeth about we're tired of having to be creative every week. This pandemic thing has kind of rewritten it, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But from our manual, because Presbyterians have manuals and text for everything, but technically, if you were to ask me what my job is, I would recite to you this paragraph, because that's what it says. I am an ordained teaching elder, but I could have been a ruling elder, and I serve as the officer of the Presbytery, and I'm responsible for the performance of the administrative and program staff and for the employment performance of the support staff. So basically, I'm responsible for running our office, and then I am responsible for the administration of the Presbytery, which means making sure committees meet, structures work, manuals and policies. And then I'm also charged with helping us figure out what our matters of mission, vision, strategy, and resources. So that's a long way of saying I make sure the trains run on time, but I'm also here to help us figure out what we want to do as a presbytery. So it's kind of a different description. In the old days, there were the Northern and Southern Church. The Northern Church has had a history of having executive or staff people. The Southern Church was a little bit different, and then that for most of our lives, if you grew up in that tradition, the stated clerk was the person who did all that, and there might be some other staff people. In the later years, they've kind of broken it up that one individual couldn't do all that. So a lot of presbyteries have an executive to handle sort of ministry, mission, and vision, leadership, and a stated clerk. But people forget that the position of EP is not in the Book of Order. The only position a presbytery has to have in the Book of Order is a stated clerk and elect a moderator. Any other staffing that the presbytery does is by election. So the only constitutionally mandated staff the presbytery has to have is a stated clerk and a moderator. So presbyteries have the right to kind of make that. In this presbytery, we've got staff to do that. But in other presbyteries, so what we do in Mid-South might not be the same that we do in Arkansas or North Carolina or other places. So you may have been in other places where they do it a little bit different. And so I want to be clear that they kind of have that way of doing that. And that goes back to the question you had, is that we've kind of in the process of rejiggering things. So I think that is, I just wanted to show you all that, and we'll go back. So What I was really called to do is, if you hadn't followed the history of our presbytery, we were in a place where not more than 10 years ago, we had twice as many churches in our presbytery. And over that time, we had a lot of departures. The denomination has gone through some significant changes. The culture of church in general has gone through changes. And so I was brought here kind of to help our presbytery move from sort of an older model into what's next. And so I kind of came and it's kind of fun to have Ann here, that Ann was right, and Rick and some of those folks on here are part of that team that began that work that hopefully will begin to complete here. But three major things that when I interviewed, I kind of talked about and saw in the presbytery that I thought we as Mid-South needed to work on or to think about. Number one is because of those departures and all those changes, and because of some dynamics with some things, we really needed to work on rebuilding those relationships. So I don't know what your experience at Presbytery has been, but I'll be very frank that for a lot of people, it wasn't a positive experience. And so we're spending a lot of time working to regain the idea that Presbytery is not just a bureaucratic thing, it's a partner thing. And we're spending a lot of time and energy resourcing staff committees, working with our pastors, helping our churches, and really trying to recreate Presbytery as what I think it should be, the partner that helps you be the best that you can be in your congregation. At the end of the day, the hard and heavy lifting are done by our frontline people like Ann and Sarah, your pastors, you all at the churches. We're here to equip that, not to tell you how to do it. And so I think that's a little bit of a change here, that we're trying to reimagine the presbytery as an empowering and an equipping unit rather than just an autocratic and bureaucratic entity. Because for many of us, presbytery is a place we go do business. We don't necessarily think of it as a place that helps us do ministry, or at least that's been a classic experience that we're trying to change. So one of the things here that we're really working on is trying to rebuild those relationships, which include having some difficult conversations about, do we need to drop things? Do we need to reorient things? And so, yes, one of the issues we're working with is what is Pinecrest to Presbytery? How does that look financially, missionally, relationally? It's been different things at different times, which has been confusing. So we have a group working on trying to figure out what that looks like. We're also having to talk about things about, we can't do everything we want to do. Maybe this sounds familiar at what you're having at your church. We can't do every program. We don't have the people or the resources. So what are the key critical, what I call missional priorities that we want to do for now? And we number them 1 through, I'm going to do 1 through 3, maybe 5. 1 is the most important, and we put our most time and money there, and we go down the list until we run out. And we revisit those every year, but that helps us focus instead of doing what we want to do, which is try and do everything. And that's a new challenge for the church this day, because there are programs that we want to do that we just don't have the bandwidth to do. And we as church people are loving people, and we want to get it all done. But I find that it's better to do 3 or 4 things really, really well than do everything mediocre. And so as a presbytery, part of what I'm here to do is help us have the conversations about what collectively as these group of churches do we want to do together. In the last month, circumstances of the world helped that kind of coalesce a little bit different. So the second part of my job is to help us be able to be responsive to the world. If you've ever been in institutions, they write these great 10-year plans and they gather dust as monoliths on a wall. And by the time you get to half of them, they're irrelevant. So one of the things we're working on here is being able to pivot. We had talked about down the road doing some racial reconciliation work in our presbytery. It was on our radar as something that we needed to talk about. But after what was going on with Minneapolis, with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, the Black Lives Movement, it became a critical discussion. Well, at council, we pivoted from some other stuff we were working on and said, this is what we need to pick up. So one of our major priorities right now is we have formed, it's got a placeholder name, but the committee's working on it. What we call the Racial, Ethnic, and Justice Task Force. And I'm proud to say, if he's on the call today, that was brought up by Joseph Hoyle, came to me and said, we got to do something. And I took that to our decision body and they came up with that. So that group that work became something that was critical to do. So that's an example of how we're moving away from being more policy oriented to being more missionally and strategically oriented. And you'll hear a whole lot about that. I don't want to steal their thunder because they just got formed, but in August, churches will get a nice full report about this new group. But Cottrell Rainey, the new pastor at Parkway Gardens United, and Beatrix, who's the chaplain at Rhodes, are co-chairing that commission. And I'm excited about their work. Another thing that I talked about when I kind of got here that I'm working on is just simple administrative things. So I'm not a big fan of this, but it's important. We have a lot of policies and manuals that are in bits and pieces because we've done it 10 different ways, and we're just trying to get it all on one page. So those of y'all who have been on a session know how much fun it is to write a manual of operations. But in order for us to be on that same page and have those rules so that I know what the rules are and you know what the rules are, we're working to try and codify those because frankly, for a long time in our presbytery, some churches and people have done it this way. No one's done it wrong, but you can't have 4 different ways of doing it and then try to explain it to somebody. So being a new person, I come in, I was like, wait a minute. So we're trying to kind of get that. So a lot of my job, as I read in the lovely description, is doing some of that like administrative things about how we're doing stuff. And then the last thing that we're working on, and the thing that I'm most passionate about, is, as I've mentioned to you, is really finding ways to resource and develop our presbytery in terms of leadership and in terms of mission. So I really think that a lot of my time and energy has been put into how can we help the people in our presbytery doing stuff do it better and do it the way they want to. And so an example of this is we have a committee on ministry that works with search processes. In the past, that committee hasn't been that great of a resource. In our search processes now, we're doing a lot more energy about helping them get information, about helping them get connections, about helping them get more training and resourcing. Our administrative board, we spend a lot of time doing training and resourcing about what are trends, what's going on out there. So we're really trying to better equip our leaders to go out there and do the work. And when they say things like, we don't know how to do this and we need some more training, we're trying to get that. When, Elizabeth, her first week here, I was like, what kind of resources and training do you need and want that you don't have? And what can I get for you? Audrey, what kind of training don't you? I want our people to have the best information, the best tools. So we're really trying to redesign Presbytery to be a place that gives resources to folks. And those resources aren't necessarily just limited to educational stuff. We're having conversations about financial resourcing, because if some of our churches are in trouble or some of our churches need help, what can we do to help that? So when I say resource, we're talking about time, treasure, and talent, not just treasure. For that. And so those are kind of the 3 major areas that to go in there to work on. So that's kind of what I was brought in to do. So that was all fine and dandy until this COVID thing happened. And what COVID has done is it's really hard to go out and visit all the churches and be in worship and sit at fellowship dinner and build all those relationships when you can't go out. So as Rick joked with me when they were interviewing me, I talked about we were going to use Zoom to try and connect people from the far corners of the presbytery. I did not want Zoom to replace the ability to drive and meet with people, but I have found that it is really challenging. Like, I'm meeting y'all this morning and I can see your smiling faces and your phone pictures, but I can't sit across the table from you. And I can't get to know you and read you and you read me and interact the same way as if we were sitting at a table with coffee and donuts. So it has been a unique challenge to try and build relationships when you can't do it the way that most folks are used to. So it's really hard to do some of this work about talking about who we are and what we are without the ability to be with your neighbor. I just moved in a new house. I can meet my neighbors from the street and I can talk to them and I can get to know them a little bit. But that's really different than having them at my dining room table and fixing dinner with them. So it's been very interesting to try and come in and do this assessment work and do some of this resourcing when you're not able to be with the people. But conversely, one of the neat things is now we're seeing people participating in church that wouldn't participate in traditional times. If we were looking at some numbers of some of our smaller and rural churches, and they have more people watching them on the feed than they had ever had attending church. So we're living in this time where, even though it's different, we're now getting connected or accessing people that might not ever darken the door of our churches, but are hungry to see what we're saying. And now when they can do it from the comfort of their home and technology. So we're living in this sort of new world where we're trying to figure out how to do things different, but the same. And so in executive work, one of the things we're spending a lot of energy and resourcing is helping people just figure out, how do we get online? How do, you guys have a live streaming team, which is fantastic, by the way. I can't say enough about Jenny and your whole team, but some folks aren't blessed enough to have that. It's a pastor and an iPhone. And so we've spent a lot of time having Zoom calls and meetings about simple things about how to record a conversation or how to set up a Zoom call and those kinds of things. And now we're having conversation about what happens when the pandemic's over. Do we keep doing this stuff? Do we still keep doing online worship and online meetings? Because as I said, we're getting this whole other thing. So we're living in this time where we're trying to figure out what the new church looks like. Because COVID is not necessarily changing the conversation. I feel COVID is sort of being Darwinian in that it's sped up. If your church was healthy before the pandemic, it's probably going to be okay. If it was sick before the pandemic might be the thing that kind of pushes it over. So that's a little bit kind of about how pandemic work makes executive work a little bit different. You're doing the same stuff in terms of the layout, but you're having to find new ways to do it. And then lastly, churches are discovering whole areas of ministry that they haven't really thought about, or they're coming up with new things. So we're getting people coming up with ideas that we've never done before. So I joke a lot that the last Presbyterian to live through a pandemic died a long time ago. I mean, 1918. There isn't a playbook. We have manuals and we've had churches for schisms or polity fights or things. You can look stuff up for, but there's never been, what does presbytery look like in a pandemic? We're going to have our first ever, as far as I can tell, and Ann had to go, so she can't check me on this, but if you guys know, our first ever digital presbytery meeting, like full on only digital presbytery meeting. And so we're doing things that we never dreamed possible. So when we had our administrative board meeting, there wasn't well, what did they do in 1980 when they had to do that? So we're having to make up things as we go along. And I use this phrase with the search committee. We're having to build the airplane, not in the hangar on the ground. We're having to build the airplane and rebuild the airplane while we're flying without crashing. So that's kind of the image that I use is it's that balance. So that's kind of a lot of me explaining things about what I'm doing and what's going on. What I was really hoping to do, and we're coming up, is ask you all sort of what kinds of things would you like to ask me or know, and let you have a chance to kind of have more of a Q&A than just me and my beautiful talking head speaking at you all morning. So that's kind of my 30,000 foot view of who I am and what I do. And now if y'all have specific questions or issues about our presbytery, or just, I can try and answer your denominational questions. I would love, if that's okay, to just kind of hear from y'all with what your questions or insights are. All right, so I'm looking at, all right, so I'll start with the chat one here. Peggy asked me the question, tell us about the 5-member church and how it can exist. Well, one thing that people don't understand is that numerical value is not how we determine whether or not a church is healthy or viable. And actually, to be fair, the 5-member church is now an 8-member church. They added 3 folks in February. But they're up in Union City, Tennessee. And the way they do it is they do mission. They have a preschool that they run for the community out of the church. So one of the marks of the church is they do mission. Number 2, they have a session that meets regularly. So they still do governance. They don't have a pastor, but every Sunday they meet together at the church and they watch a taped message from someone. They do a brief Bible study, and then they pray together, and then they have lunch together. So they have a vibrant worshiping community. They have insurance and pay all their bills. So when I look at the marks of those things, is they are doing mission, they are doing worship, they are doing governance. There might only be 5 or 8 of them, and they're able to manage their great. So that's one of the things that folks don't understand is that a 12, 8-member church can be very vibrant. They don't have a big facility. They don't have a lot of other stuff, but they're doing the things that a vibrant congregation would do. So that's how they exist. If they weren't able to pay their bills, if they weren't doing mission, if they were just 5 people and they never gathered, then we would have a discussion. And that's a great question, because I know 50-member churches that don't do those things. And so sometimes when we think about church vitality, we measure it in terms of dollars, programs, and people rather than actual spiritual vitality. And so that's how that church can exist, is because they're doing all the things of the church. And like I said, in the middle of COVID, they had 3 folks join. So they must, for them, if you have a 5-member church and you add 3, that looks great on your statistical report. You grew by what, 60%? So that's a really good question. Let's see. So that's one. Someone asked, Stephanie asked a question, is Synod really needed in these days of rapid transportation? That's a tough one for me, to be honest, to answer, because I'm a former Synod executive. So I will say, I think Synod is needed, but I think some synods are better than others. I think there are synods out there that need to look at how they're formed and what they're formed. I do think that a group of presbyteries can do mission and ministry together better than they can apart, especially in geographic areas like Texas, where you might not be able to find another Presbyterian church or another presbytery with population for a long time. So some of those big geographic areas, like in Kansas, we have long swaths where you'll have a church in one town and it's 2 hours to the next church. And so presbytery is very geographically spread. So Synod is still helpful there, but I think it's a good question to ask, is maybe what we need is better boundaries of how we draw things for that. That's what I advocated for, was not necessarily doing away with it, but realigning it to fit where the people are, because the boundaries that are there right now were drawn in 1983, and the population shifted just a little bit since then. So I would advocate, we need them, but I would advocate for reorganizing and restructuring. But that's me. That's a good question. Any thoughts about, all right, Melissa says, any thoughts about getting other churches to increase their giving to presbytery beyond per capita? Yeah, Melissa, did Michael ask you to ask that question, or are you just being a good human being? Michael's our treasurer. That's why I'm making the joke, y'all. Of course, I would love everyone to increase their giving above per capita. Here's the real answer. I think if Presbytery does her job right and we give people something to be excited about and a mission and purpose that resonates with the people, that the finances will come. I generally feel like when people don't really want to participate in Presbytery, it's because they don't see value in it. And my job and our job as a presbytery is to create a place that has value. So I would like to see that, but I don't think we're going to get it without earning it. So we need to have mission and projects and programming that resonate with people. For instance, your food bank is something that people love. If you ask for something for the food bank, people will support it in 5 minutes because it has value that people can touch. It has results that they can see. So I think in our ministry, if we create things like that, I think it'll get people excited and the finances will follow along. But yes, we'll always take more giving. I mean, I'd be silly to say no, but I'll be honest that I think that you can't ask without putting something behind it as well. So part of our challenge is to get people excited for. So great question. Marilyn, let's see, Donnelly, were you involved with Theo Academy? It was a private question, but I'm going to answer, I'll answer it publicly. Yes, I'm the guy in the first 2 videos that filmed the talking head. And I'm the guy that did the video production part, but I wasn't the talent. For the later 2 series, we were too busy and we hired a professional staff. So that's why the confirmation one looks better, is because they had professional people. But I was very excited about that. And thank you for asking, because we have access to all those Theo Academy materials because Landon's gracious and I helped create them. So if you don't know about them, they are new members DVDs as well as a confirmation kit and another series they did on sort of confessions, church things, and they're all available online. So it's a digital learning resource for those. But I don't want to
wish I had invented it.
Yeah,
I wish I had invented it.
Well, short story, what happened was people wanted resources and they didn't have $59.99 to buy it from Cokesbury. And then we had a lot of commission ruling elders, or what we call lay pastors, who wanted training but couldn't afford to go to Dubuque. And so the presbyteries came to us and said, what do we do? And we said, okay, here's a harebrained idea. We'll make the resources. And that's kind of how it came out of it. And it's still going. And hopefully post-COVID, we were going to have some of them come down and do some work with our presbytery. So that's a great resource to do that. Is the presbytery attracting younger members to be involved on committees, et cetera? If not, is there an emphasis to get more young people? Peggy, you're going to get put on a committee if you keep asking such good questions, if you're not already going to be asked. But yes, we are definitely trying to get a better mixture of people. That's another thing we're working on is, and I think all of us are trying to do this. We're not warm bodies, but intentional bodies. So yes, we're trying to get younger people, which also means we're looking at things like, is 7 o'clock on a Tuesday or 3 o'clock on a Thursday the best time to meet to get those folks? One of the gifts of the pandemic is things like being able to Zoom is, like, for instance, I have a wife and 2 children. My wife's in ministry. Back in the day, I would much prefer to do a 2 o'clock Zoom meeting on my lunch break than have to drive to church in person in the evening and do meetings. So we're not just trying to recruit young people. We're trying to recruit a whole different group of folks. And that makes us figure out what's the best way to even do our meetings. Like, for instance, Presbytery meeting, we've had conversations about having the summer meeting, the August meeting, be virtual, just so that when people are on vacation or all over the place, they can still participate and not miss things, but not have to give up going to the beach to go to a Presbytery meeting. So that question kind of answers 2 things. We're trying to get younger people as well as other people involved, and we're trying to figure out how to restructure that. Let's see. Jeremy's question, do any churches in our presbytery employ an executive pastor model where the executive functions typically held by head of staff and are split off into separate positions? No. In our presbytery, there are really only 2 churches that would be able to have a staff to do that. That would be y'all and Germantown. The church I grew up in had that model with the head of staff that was sort of the preacher, teacher, pastor, and then an executive pastor who was a business person, but also a pastor who did sort of all that kind of stuff and oversaw what we'd call technical operations things. And that's kind of how they split it up. And in presbyteries, there's bigger presbyteries like Atlanta have a little bit more like that model where the executive does that. Unfortunately, in this presbytery, Audrey and I split up a lot of those little management details, and I'm try to focus more of my work on those things. But being that we're 6 months in and new, there's still a lot more uploading to do. So just like churches, you can find 100 different models for that. And I think to answer your question, it really depends on the context. I've seen it work really well if you do it right, and I've seen it be disastrous if you don't have the right people. But I think it's a good model that anytime you can share the load of the work, it makes it better because people can spend more time on what they're good at. So I think if we had the ability to parse some things out, if we had the finances, I'd love to have a staff of 4 or 5 people. Elizabeth's heard me give this sermon 100 times, just because I think we could do a lot more work and do it better, but that's just not a fiscal reality. Let's see. First Presbyterian Church, Wilson, North Carolina. Okay, and White Memorial. Yep, I was born and raised in White Memorial. I joined it 3 times from 1976 to 1990. Yeah, so that's the church that I was under care of. And then First Wilson, I know that church well. Let's see. There you go. And then some more. Tell the search. Let's see. Melissa, what's your second question? Oh, you're talking to someone else. Okay, cool. So again, I think you're all kind of asking that really good question. Someone asked the question about the church of the future, and what does that look like? And here's kind of how I see it. Our church, PCUSA, is sort of at a threshold. We have been a large, white, well-to-do denomination for most of our existence. The fastest growing segments of our denomination right now are not white churches. They are usually what we would classically call people of color, ethnic churches, those kinds of things. When people ask me about church size, well, actually, let's have a fun thing. What do y'all think would be considered a large church in our denomination? Because when I think of large church, I'm thinking 300, 400, 500 people. But if you look at the average size in PCUSA, if you're over 200 members, you're moving. If you take out the top 10 big churches, the 3, 4, 5,000 ones, you take them out. Most of our churches are in about a big size church is 200 plus. So if you think about a 120 member church is a pretty good sized church, is a medium sized church, I think that reframes the dynamic, because in my brain, because I grew up in a huge church, that would be a small church. And so one of the things that the future church is we're moving away from understanding church vitality from numbers and dollars and programs to how do we measure spiritual vitality? How do we measure discipleship? How do we talk about, you have a gazillion members, but how engaged are they? So one of the things the future church is asking itself is what is church and what does healthy church look like? So we talked about the 5-member church. To me, that's a really healthy church. It's not numerically large and they've got some challenges, but their discipleship, their spiritual component, where the giant church I grew up in, they're probably 20% of that church that I never saw and never persisted. They're not bad, but how do you say this church is healthy and this isn't, kind of thing? We don't have a good tool. So I think the church of the future is having to really discern what the heck is church and how do we measure it? And now, as I said, with COVID, is church of the future not even necessarily tied to the physical plant? Is the church of the future maybe a hybrid of something virtual with something else? We don't know. So we're really having to discern what is church. And then, as I was saying earlier, who is church? Because who's at the table and making those decisions and how they're made and what that looks like is a lot different. So one of the exciting things I think that's happening, at least in PCUSA, is we are no longer clinging to the things of old. We're having discussions like this General Assembly was supposed to be one where we really spent a lot of time distilling that. We did not get a chance to do that. And in my opinion, we did it very poorly. But we're having those conversations about who are we and what are we. Now, your church and some of your local congregations, churches are way ahead of the larger curve. So what happens is congregations get out front and then presbyteries take a few years or decades to catch up, and then GAs a few years behind that. So churches blaze a trail 15 years before we get there. But I think as a whole, we're having those conversations that what is church? I think that is literally the $1 million question is what is church and who is church? And what does that look like going forward? And we've got to start answering that. And when you answer that question, then we ask questions like, well, do we need a middle governing structure? What do we need to resource that? What does that look like? So I think the future church will be built from the congregation up instead of up going down to the congregation. So that was a really, really good question. 150, yeah. See, when we look at the numbers in the chat, I mean, who would have thought that a 120, 150 member church would be statistically right there at medium size, knocking it out? Nothing wrong with that, but I think we all kind of have that mindset that does that. From earlier presentation, what are the 6 great ends of the church? I'm embarrassed, we don't know. Well, I'm not sure I could rattle them all off the top of my head, but they're things like the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of humankind, the maintenance of divine worship, the nurture and spiritual care of the children of God, the exhibition of the kingdom of heaven on earth, the proclamation of the gospel, the right administration of the sacraments and the word. And Elizabeth, what's the one there you go. It's in the chat word for word, taken from, did you type those or did you cut and paste?
No, I copied and pasted that.
Okay. All right. Well, there you go. I didn't get them, but there you go. So I didn't get them exactly word for word, but there you go. And they're from the F section. So those are the great ends of the church that you get from that. Good question. And don't ever be embarrassed that you don't know them. If you don't know, you don't ask question. Again, like I said, I feel like I'm talking more to y'all and want to give y'all a chance if there's something you want to ask. Again, there's not a bad question. You're not going to get in trouble. But if there's any other questions you have about things or difficult things you want to ask me about in terms of who we are and what we are, I'm happy to do those for you this morning. Oh, is Mary Lou raising her hand? All right, then unmute and fire away. Where is she? Oh, hold on. Elizabeth, Mary Lou's talking, but it's muted. Can you unmute her so she can ask her question?
I'm trying to find her.
She's on the second page.
Oh, I see her.
Yeah.
Is she unmuted now?
Mary Lou, are you still talking? Where'd she go?
Yes, I'm still talking.
There you are. All right, you're unmuted. Ask your question. Fire away, ma'am.
All right, it has to do with the church at the National General Assembly level.
Okay.
I've been surprised that the Presbyterian Church USA has not issued some kind of statement about how, as Christians, we see that what we're being asked to do to try to control COVID is the ultimate, or not, I won't say ultimate, is the expression of love thy neighbor as thyself. And the church has spoken out on all kinds of issues over the years. And because of the nature of how the COVID scene has gone, I just am personally wishing that my church would speak out.
Well, no, that's a great question. They haven't issued what we call a white paper, a formative thing, but if you follow some of the stuff put out from the mission agency and things, they have sort of done Facebook things and other things like wear your mask, love thy neighbor. There's been some good internet stuff, but you're right. And I would say that that's also a challenge, and it's a challenge from our office to encourage as far as we can, but we don't have the ability to mandate it. So this is one of those times that if I was a bishop, I'd be like, wear thy mask, and that's the rule. The Methodist Church can say that. We can strongly encourage, we can put a lot of things there, but there's not a way to make folks. So that's part of the challenge with that. So that's a great question. I love where you're coming from about, and I think the tack that many of us have chosen of, it's not about legality or politics or thing. It's about, I wear this mask, not just for me, but for my neighbor. And I'm finding that to be pretty effective. But you're right. I wish there was a little bit more. We talk about that in the mid-council chats. We talk about how far can we push that line? How far can we go for that? Because unfortunately, mask wearing became politicized, and then it gets a lot thornier to deal with a political issue than just one. So we're trying not to deal with it as a political issue, but as a theological one, as you articulated. We don't do this because of red or blue or whatever. We do it because we love our neighbor and it might save his or her life, and that's what we're here for. So that's a really great observation, is that we've been a lot more muddled on that than maybe folks would want. But if you listen, I think it's out there, but you're right. It hasn't been a coordinated effort the same way that we are with racial justice or economic justice. So that's a great question and a good.
Could I just add this?
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
That I'm not talking about mandates. I'm not talking about rules and regulations. I'm talking about coming from a theological, and I would change that word to a faith point of view, that the church simply says, this is who we are, because this is what Christ directed us to be and do. And I would just, maybe this is dangerous territory, but if General Assembly hasn't done it, and heaven knows by the time they write a white paper, COVID will have been cured. So I'm not for that. But why can't the presbytery speak out to the citizens of the Mid-South and say, this is who we are, and not in a accusatory way, but a statement of faith way. Anyway, that's just my challenge to you. Thank you.
No, that's a great question, and I'm gonna write that down, and then I'm gonna, at our next meeting in August, I will ask our board that very great question. So thank you. That's a we have not done that officially, and that's a good question. Can we and should we is not hard to answer, but that's a good question. Thank you for that challenge. And then Ms. Carey says we can always ask the stated clerk, and she means Jay Herbert, the national stated clerk, to speak out on that. And he has done some stuff, but not nearly as vociferously as some other things. So I could see that. And then you asked about the statement on John Lewis and Reverend Vivian. I would imagine those will be forthcoming, given that they just happened. I would be shocked if there's not something up by Monday or Tuesday afternoon.
James, we're coming close to the end of our time, but I do want to point out that Peggy McClure had a question in the chat too.
All right. Well, what's the last one? We'll take that one's the last one. Which one did I miss?
Yeah. On average, within our presbytery, what is the main thing that attracts younger members? Outreach, children's programming, sermons, etc.
You know what? I'm not a younger person. I'm in my mid 40s, so maybe I'm the wrong person to ask. But I would say that in my experience, younger people, especially millennials, aren't as interested in programs and things as they are about relationships. When they walk in your church, they could care less about those things and more about, does this place feel like a place I can be connected to and feel welcomed in? So I think it's all about community and authenticity in that community would be what I think attracts younger people. Elizabeth may be able to speak better to that as someone who works with our younger people, but I think the days of trying to get them there with gimmicks and things, or not gimmicks, but programs or things are a little bit gone. I think people could see that. I think they want to walk in and, does this feel like a place that I feel welcome and I can belong? And that's what they're after. And then research shows that the number one thing that younger folks do before they visit a church is they don't call friends or family, they go to websites. And so website information and as a website give me a sense of welcome. And that's what sort of a quick answer to a question. So yeah, we're up against that. You guys have asked really difficult questions this morning. Again, I do this for a living, so thank you. This is really fun and exciting for me. I know for some of you, you're like, wow, polity and things, but I want to say a thank you for a chance to talk with you and be with you, and just say that if you're interested in being a part of our work in the presbytery, or you want to help us with that, we're always looking for folks. And then if you want to do the most helpful thing, we could really use your prayers and your support for the work we're doing here in the Mid-South and for that. But again, thank you so much for being with me, and thank you for the Idlewild Church has been a wonderful partner and supporter of ministry here, and we couldn't do it without you. So again, thank you for all of you and for your church's wonderful leadership. So thanks for being with us this morning, and I guess it's time to get ready to go to church.
Thank you so much, James. This was really informative and helpful. Thanks.
And if they have other stuff, or you have things you were afraid to ask, send it to Elizabeth, or give me a call at the office, or Ann. Again, if there are other things, I'm always here, like I said, to be a resource about things. And blessings on your day. Be well and be safe.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.